Welcome to our 88th podcast for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. And our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net. And you can email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. Many of our listeners would have heard about Bletchley Park in the UK that became the principal centre of Allied code breaking during the Second World War. During the war, Australia had its own code breakers. David Kenyon, research historian at Bletchley Park, joins us to tell us about our links with the famous site. Joining us from the United Kingdom this morning is David Kenyon, a research historian at Bletchley Park. Now, David, thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Now, for our Australian listeners, let's first learn about the role of Bletchley Park during World War II, if we could start there, please.
Sure. Well, Bletchley Park is the wartime home of an organisation known as the Government Code and Cipher School. It's not a school, it doesn't teach anybody anything. That is the cover name for a signals intelligence organisation. And I say signals intelligence because they are doing code breaking, but they're doing, by the end of the war, doing a lot more than code breaking, which we can get into. They're at Bletchley Park from 1939 to 1946. Actually, the organisation was founded at the end of the World War I in 1919 and continues to exist in Cheltenham as GCHQ, the UK's current SIGINT agency. So it's actually a 100-year-old organisation, but we at Bletchley Park focus on the period it spent at Bletchley Park, which is basically World War II.
And where is Bletchley Park located?
It's about 40 miles north of London. There's a trunk road called the A5, which ultimately takes you to Wales. But if you go up that road for about an hour, you get to Bletchley. And of course, in those days, we're now a suburb of Milton Keynes, but Milton Keynes is a post-war new town that was established in 1967. So Bletchley was a much less notable place in those days. Basically a railway junction.
Now, Australia began its signals intelligence activities in 1942 when the Australian Army and the Royal Australian Air Force created what was known as the Central Bureau with the US Army, and also in the same year, the Royal Australian Navy and the US Navy created what was called Fleet Radio Unit in Melbourne in Fremantle. What were the first links between Australia and Bletchley Park?
Well, the links go back a little bit more than that, because back in the 1930s, GCNCS, as it was called, when it was based in London at that point, they were looking for somebody who had command of Japanese and could do code breaking. And there was a distinct dearth of people who spoke Japanese at that period. And they settled on a chap called Eric Nave, who was actually serving in the Royal Australian Navy. And he was seconded from the Royal Australian Navy to the Royal Navy to serve in an outfit called the Far East Combined Bureau, FECB, that it started out in Hong Kong, and in 1939 it moved to Singapore. It was in Singapore till Singapore was overrun in 1942. Then it moved to Ceylon, then Kilindini and Mombasa, and then back to Ceylon. So it had a bit of a peripatetic life. But before the start of the Japanese War, it was quite a small setup, and Eric Nave was absolutely fundamental to that operation. And indeed, he having worked in Singapore, he moved to London to Bletchley for a while before going back out east again. So he's an Australian who's a key figure in the anti-Japanese effort right from the beginning.
And when Australia started to create either the Central Bureau or Fremantle, were there personnel from Bletchley Park who actually travelled to Australia to assist, or what were the links when the Australians first established their SIGINT capabilities?
There are links, because when Singapore is overrun in spring of 1942, a lot of personnel from there are evacuated to Australia, and going with them are a number of the staff from FECB who have come originally from GCNCS, and they get absorbed initially into the operation in Melbourne. Amongst those is Arthur Cooper, who is quite well known. We mentioned him on our Christmas podcast because he took his pet gib to Australia who ended up in Melbourne Zoo. So there are a number of British personnel, and Eric Nave travels back from the UK, but he's initially deemed to be too ill to serve in the tropics, as they call it. So they send him to Melbourne as well. So there's a lot of interchange between the various outfits. And of course, in the run up to the Japanese War, and then in 1942, you get this British-Australian sort of intersection. But then with the fall of the Philippines, Station Cast, which is the US's other, after Hawaii, it's probably their biggest SIGINT operation in the Philippines. That it turns up in Australia as well. And one could argue that's when the trouble starts. Because, you have a lot of chiefs and not very many Indians at that point.
So Australia is, after the creation of these units in 1942, are starting to do their own intercepts and SIGINT from an Australian perspective. But did they also collect traffic that went back to Bletchley Park, or could you sort of expand on the relationship, both from a sharing information and a technical perspective between Bletchley Park and the Australian SIGINT units during the war?
Well, they are doing collection. They have intercept stations, and they are kind of uniquely positioned to capture Japanese material from where they are, especially once Singapore has fallen and Burma and Malaysia have been invaded. The Royal Navy, for example, FECB is forced to move to Mombasa in Kenya, which is the intercept from there is pretty terrible. So, and the US obviously are working from Hawaii, but Australia is kind of uniquely placed to capture radio signals, and that is being shared with the other powers. But one of the difficulties in the Pacific theatre is intercepting material is one thing, but distributing it to your allies is a whole other thing, because the distances are so great that you can't just put it in a bag and send it, or you can, but it takes a while, and the cable links are poor, so you're reduced to sending it by wireless. And there are two problems with that. One is simply the capacity to transmit enough of it, and the other is how you encipher it, because you can't, if you intercept a Japanese message, you can't just rebroadcast it, because the Japanese will know you've intercepted it. So they have to figure out ways of re-enciphering the material, and that's fine if you're sending it. One of the problems in Second World War, if you're sending material to your own people, you can use your own ciphers, and that's fine. But if you're sending it to an ally who uses a completely different cipher system, then you get problems. And the story of the Pacific War from a SIGINT point of view is at least in part the story of how they develop the relationship, how they get around all their various liaison and relation and communication problems. There are two key agreements which are produced. Sort of, it's the first time they start thinking about how code breaking should be divided up, and they basically say the Americans will run the project against the Japanese, and the British will run the project. BRUSA, that's the agreement, Britain, USA, and that the British will run the operation against the Germans. So that puts the Americans kind of in the driving seat for the operation in the Pacific. But part of the issue there is the Americans, they feel like they're doing the heavy lifting militarily, and sharing intelligence with their allies who they feel aren't necessarily doing a great deal feels like an added burden that's not necessarily very useful to them. So the British and the Australians have to campaign quite hard to keep the flow of intelligence coming to them. When you end up with a situation where the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean is theoretically being supplied with intercept by the US, but they continue their own intercept because they're just not getting any, or they're not getting enough. And you throw personalities into the mix. You're probably expecting me to talk about this. There is Rudy Fabian as well, who is a US naval officer who is sent to run Brumel in Melbourne and Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne. And he doesn't like any foreigners anywhere near anything he's doing. He likes it to be a US operation, and he actually has it written into the treaty that Eric Nave isn't allowed in his building, which shows you the level to which relationships had sunk. And actually, the Central Bureau team basically all up sticks and go to Brisbane, where he can't bother them, I think.
From an Australian perspective, these days the relationship between the services are a whole lot better. But you had a distinct SIGINT capability that laid with the RAF and the Army, known as Central Bureau, and then the Navy had Fremantle. From a Bletchley Park perspective, was it as segregated as that, or was it probably a little bit of a better relationship from a tri-service perspective?
Even from a Bletchley Park perspective, things are quite divided up. I mean, the Far East Combined Bureau is basically the Royal Navy. One historian remarks of it that it was neither combined nor in the Far East by the time it ended up in Kenya.
Mm-hmm.
But that starts out as theoretically a tri-service organisation, but it is basically Royal Navy dominated. And then the British Army and the Army in India set up an operation called the Wireless Experimental Centre in Delhi, which is a very significant SIGINT operation. And they have another operation in Abbottabad, in what's now Pakistan, made famous as the home of Osama bin Laden, of course. There's a certain amount of service discontinuity, I would say, in the British arrangements. And the other tension that exists throughout the war is centralized versus local. This is the idea that the powers that be at Bletchley Park are aware that keeping all your experts together is the most effective way to make progress, certainly cryptanalytically. But that creates the problem that if you put all your code breakers in one place, all of the material has to get to them and get back from them. And both the operations in Australia and FECB, and indeed the Combined Bureau Middle East, CBME in Cairo, in Heliopolis, there's all these arguments about, will you let us have code breakers? Will you let us have materials that allow us to do the breaking locally? And obviously, if you're sitting in Cairo or Ceylon, that makes sense. But if you're sitting in London, it makes less sense. So there is this these arguments go, and they never really settle it, because, and the thing about these systems that people forget, and I encounter this a lot with our visitors, is people think that once you've broken a code, you've broken it. Enigma, for example, they change the settings of the machine every day, so you need to re-break it every 24 hours. The Japanese JN25, which is their key naval code system, which is a book code. You have a code book and an additive book of numbers that you combine to make your messages. They change that book towards the end of the war on almost a monthly basis. And they change the additive books on a similar cycle. So it's not just a routine matter of you break the code and then you read the messages. You have to keep re-breaking the code over and over again. One of the reasons for success is that the Japanese find it as hard to distribute the code books as the Allies find to break the system. And so you get occasions where Japanese operators are using the old code book instead of the new one, or the old additive book instead of the new one, and that causes vulnerabilities that allow the Allies to attack the system. But it's a demonstration of the complexities of the project on both sides. The way it finally gets solved is again after the 1942, the Brucer Agreement in 43. They set up a thing called the Brucer Network, and what this is a system of organized cable and wireless connections between all of the SIGINT agencies, allied SIGINT agencies around the world. And you see diagrams of this in books, and you have OP-20G, which is the US Navy's operation in Washington, D.C. You have Pearl Harbor, FRUPAC, you have Melbourne, you have FECB, you have Bletchley Park, and they're all connected by this organized system. And they introduce code systems. Rather cunningly, they produce a thing called the Combined Cipher Machine, the CCM. What that means is the Americans can use their can't remember which machine it is. They have a cipher machine anyway, and the British have Typex. And those two machines don't normally talk to each other, but they develop an attachment that can be bolted to both machines that allow them to interact without either side sharing the intimacies of their technology with the other side. So what this means is you can share traffic, intercepted traffic, between all these various centers more efficiently. I wouldn't say completely efficiently, but certainly much more efficiently. And so you get, by the latter part of the war, you get a much better traffic flow. And also at the very end of the war, by 1945, the bulk of the Royal Navy has moved to the Pacific, and the war against Germany is over. So the focus can be very much more on that theatre. And one of the things you notice among our veteran population and the staff of Bletchley Park in particular was that in late 44, 45, they start moving personnel to eastwards to Sri Lanka and to Delhi in large numbers. And there's a big cohort of Wrens who suddenly find themselves on ships heading out east. And in the end, this is one of the things that I spent a lot of time talking about last year for the anniversaries, that we now know when the war ended in the East, but the expectation was not that it would end in August 1945. The expectation was in August or September, the ground invasion of Japan would start. And the ground invasion of Japan would have dwarfed D-Day. It was an enormous operation, and it would have been incredibly costly and time-consuming. It would have taken it well into 1946. There's a lot of work done to build up signals capability, all aspects of military power in 1945 that gets forgotten because ultimately it doesn't go anywhere, as the bombs get dropped. But definitely by 44, 45, the system in the US, Australian, British system has reached a reasonable level of efficiency, and everybody is more or less talking to everybody else. The role of Bletchley Park by that point is not huge. They are breaking Japanese traffic in the UK at Bletchley, but that is traffic that's been sent to them sometimes by bag from Washington DC. And the reason they're breaking it isn't so much because it's vital to fight the war. It's because GC&CS wants to keep up its expertise in that particular field of code breaking. And you see this across the board with the sharing of different projects between the Allied powers, that it's as much about keeping your own team au fait with the rules of the game as it is actually producing product.
You mentioned, obviously, towards the end of 44, 45, you got the E-Day, and there was some migration of staff from Bletchley towards the Pacific Theatre. But did any Australians actually serve at Bletchley Park during the war?
I did a check on our Roll of Honour just now, our online list of people, and I couldn't find anybody who had served in Bletchley. There were Australian personnel in the outposts in Singapore and Colombo and elsewhere. So there may have been one or two that we missed, but they certainly don't have any presence at Bletchley Park on a noticeable scale. So it tends to be, the traffic tends to be from the UK out east and not vice versa. But we consider the work done at the various stations in Australia to be part of our very much part of our story. And as I say, there are Women's Royal Australian Naval Service personnel on our Roll of Honour because all the people that worked at Fremantle we consider to be veterans of ours.
Bletchley Park family, of course.
Part of the Bletchley Park family, very much, yes.
Now, you've been so gracious to give your time to be on my podcast today, but you folks also do your podcast. So can you tell us a little bit about that, please?
Certainly. My computer told me today I've been at Bletchley Park for 11 years today, which is way longer than it was open during the war. We, for about the last 10 years, have been running a monthly podcast, where it's evolved a little bit, but basically the current format is that I and our other historian, Tom, with occasional special guests, we pick a historical subject connected with GC&CS every month. And sometimes that's driven by anniversaries, sometimes it's driven by particular projects that Tom or I are working on, and we'll cover a historical story once a month, and it lasts about an hour. We've now, as I say, I've been there 10 years. I've been around World War II twice now with the anniversaries. But there's no way we've run out of things to talk about.
You
It's
don't.
such a massive
That's right.
subject
You don't.
that we can keep going. And what's rather fun is to be able to, if we're doing a particular piece of research, to be able to distill that into a podcast and put it out. This month's one has just gone out, I think. I got a note. Did you listen to last month's about the Italians?
I did, yes.
That was a good fun one, that one. When you get told your code's being broken by the Pope, you know something's gone a bit wrong.
Exactly. That's right.
I can say we're simply called the Bletchley Park podcast. We haven't been very imaginative, but it means it's very easy to find.
From a day-to-day basis, you've been there for 11 years. What do you do on a daily basis as a research historian at Bletchley Park?
The short answer is I read books about World War II and get paid for it. But my job was created because 10 years ago, Bletchley went through a massive regeneration and we restored a lot of buildings and sorted everything out. At the end of that project, the board realised that had they had their own historian, the whole project would have been a lot easier. And so I was appointed, and my role and Tom's role is to support all of our content with facts. So everything we say to the public through exhibitions or online or in talks, whatever, that has to be supported by evidence that we gather. And so at the moment, we have 2 future large-scale permanent exhibitions, which Tom and I are working on. And we also have all sorts of shorter-term content that we're creating, pop-up exhibitions, online content. And so all of those things start with me and Tom finding out what the facts are and producing historical data that can then feed off to the exhibition designers or the event coordinators or whatever. Most of the archive, we have an archive of material in Bletchley Park, but most of the material has been released by GCHQ to the National Archives in London at Kew. So we're both down there regularly looking at the original source material, which is a wonderful privilege to do that as a job, to go down there and read this stuff. And it's mostly available now. It's been declassified gradually over the years since the late 70s. But we're now at a point that more or less everything is available. But very little of it's actually been read by historians. So you've always got new things to find out. The trouble with going to the archives is rabbit holes. You go there to look up one thing, and you immediately come across something else fascinating, and you have to kind of hold yourself in check that you don't end up.
You have to remind
confused.
yourself you got to go home at the end of the day.
Well, exactly.
Now, thousands. Sorry.
But it is a tremendous privilege, though, to be able to spend my time doing that.
Thousands of Australians visit the UK each year, and obviously, Bletchley Park is a major tourist attraction. What would they find at Bletchley Park today?
Well, the site consists of the historic mansion and stable yard, which were there in 1939. But then what a lot of people don't appreciate is the organisation, which started out as fewer than 200 people in 1939, employed 8,000 people by 1945. So our site is actually massive. It's a lot larger, and our visitor area only occupies about half of it. But we have wartime buildings, the famous huts, which we've restored, but also the later war brick block buildings, and they contain exhibitions on a wide variety of different aspects of the story. So obviously we have the famous Hut 8 and Hut 3 and 6, which were Enigma. We have material on the Lorentz ciphers. I did a project on D-Day, so there's information about that. There's a big gallery about the late war site, how people lived, how they were fed, how they got to work. And so there's a huge variety of stuff. You have the problem that the more visitors you attract as a museum, the more space you need to put them in. But then the more space there is to put them in, the longer they stay. And we now work on the basis that if you buy a ticket, it's valid for a year. Because if you see everything, you probably won't get round in a day. So we say to people, come back as many times as you like. which many of them do. And the other thing is that don't be fooled by the idea that we're a country house. The train from Euston goes to Bletchley Station in less than an hour, and it stops right outside our front gate. Station's opposite across the road, so we're actually really easy to get to. I sometimes figure that if you were standing in Trafalgar Square and you wanted to go to the Science Museum in Kensington, it probably wouldn't take you much longer to get to Bletchley, depending on the vagaries of the underground. But so we do get a significant portion of visitors from Australia, New Zealand, the US, Canada, the countries that were part of the story at the time. And
so where can people go to find out more about Bletchley Park?
We have a website that is mostly focused on how to visit us and what's on site. If you want more of the history story and you're not, for whatever reason you can't come from Australia to visit us, certainly have a listen to the podcast. There is a lot of good literature out there about the story. I'm naturally going to plug my own book, so I've written two. One is about D-Day. One of the things we had to for D-Day, we wanted to create an exhibition or an experience which gave you the so what. So much of the story of Bletchley Park is how are codes broken, how is intelligence created. The reason we remember it is because it influenced the outcome of the war. And so we wanted a so what story, what difference does it make? And D-Day is a perfect example because everyone's heard of it. It's a major event and it happens at a period when Bletchley Park was sort of at the height of its powers. So I spent 2 years researching the SIGINT aspects of D-Day. And that got turned into what is actually a 12-minute film, or it's a sort of projection. It's 20 meters long and 10 meters high. It's an enormous thing. But it was, my 2 years' work got distilled down into 10 minutes. But on the basis of that research, I also thought, well, I'll write a book as well. So, and when I've experienced this twice now, that you go, oh, I've done loads of research, I'll write a book, that'll be straightforward. And then you start writing the book and you realize you've only done half the research that you need.
And what's the name of the book?
Again, very straightforward, Bletchley Park and D-Day. The publishers told me there are two things most people know about. If they do an internet search, they'll find it. So that came out to 2019 when we opened the exhibition. And then we were doing the Block A project. Block A was occupied by a naval section. And so I got heavily involved with researching the naval story. And one aspect of that really caught my imagination was the Arctic convoys, because the signals intelligence element of that is very significant. And it's an interesting story to tell, because if you try and write the history of the Battle of the Atlantic, you'd be writing for a very long time, because it's a very large subject. The Arctic convoys are kind of a microcosm that display some of the same characteristics of the Atlantic, but actually a lot of things that are different. But it's a small enough operation. There's something like 78 convoys that you can actually get your head around it in one book. So Arctic convoys came out.
Put you on the spot now, because you've spoken about the significance of SIGINT for the Arctic convoys and D-Day. In the Pacific theatre, the thing that stands out for me is probably the intercept about the travel of General Yamamoto and the aircraft that was intercepted. Is there anything else that comes to mind from your perspective for the Pacific theatre of the significance of an intercept that might have changed the path?
Well, this is a point that I find myself making very frequently, that I'm not a believer in the importance of individual messages, and moments like the Yamamoto shoot down are important, but not necessarily game changing. What SIGINT does best is it builds pictures like jigsaws. And to summarize my point about D-Day, it was they start in 1942 and they spend nearly 2 years collecting little tiny pieces of information about the German military in France and Belgium. And they put those together over 2 years until when it comes to 6th of June, they know everything about all 58 German divisions in France. They know how many tanks they've got, how many men they've got, who the commanders are, what the commanders' birthdays are, how many NCOs they don't have. They've got a complete picture. It's what the GCHQ historian once described to me as information dominance. It's the idea that you know everything about your enemy. And if you have that knowledge, most of those individual messages on their own would be of relatively little value. But the key lies in, and this is without computers, with old library index cards, capturing all of that data and compiling it and putting it together gradually over time. The far recent example is once they break into the Japanese merchant ship codes, what they call the Maru code, the US is able to mount an absolutely devastating submarine campaign against Japanese, and it's not, we call it merchant shipping, but it's the supply ships supporting all their forces in the Pacific theater. So the US submarine service just sets about sinking virtually all of those ships. And that's not based on one message, and it's not kind of the movie scene where somebody breaks one message. It's just day in, day out, knowing absolutely what your enemy's doing, knowing when every ship sails, knowing where it's going, setting up to find it and destroy it. And if you do that well, it's kind of irresistible. There's nothing your enemy can do about it, really. And the reason that the US Marine campaign on these islands is successful is because those Japanese troops have been starved of supplies because the ships just can't get there. And if you consider those ships are also carrying the updated code books, they can't update their cipher systems, so it becomes a vicious circle.
David, Kenyon, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, it's been my pleasure.
That's the podcast for today. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your review helps new listeners to find our podcast. If you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. And you can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history research packages sources records to better understand the service and experience of those who've served. You can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.